What a horrible thing to do. Or is it? In this video, I want to show you a simple but powerful technique for making your novel's villain 10 times more interesting. And it works not by making the villain horrible, but paradoxically by making him nicer. Instead of making him bad, we make him human. And we'll be looking at this clip from the Frankenstein movie of Frankenstein's monster throwing the 11-year-old Maria into the water. When they released the movie in 1931, they cut this clip because they deemed it was too brutal. But I think it might be one of the most misunderstood clips in movie history. So welcome to another installment in my series on how to write your novel using that most unlikely of writing implements, a round Oxford bus ticket. Well, okay, let's try and remove symbolically the bolts from the monster's neck. Our task is to find some aspect of goodness in our villain, or some backstory of injustice that partially redeems him. They do this in the movie Batman Returns, where they depart from convention by giving the character of the Penguin, real name Oswald Cobblepot, a tragic backstory. We see him being born to wealthy parents who are so appalled by his appearance that they throw him into the river, and he floats through the city sewers and arrives at the abandoned Gotham City Zoo, where the penguins find him and raise him. Absolute storytelling genius. To illustrate our theme, I've taken the bus down to this place, Magdalen College, to follow in the footsteps of a young man who studied here in the 1870s, Oscar Wilde. Now, of course, Oscar Wilde was no criminal mastermind like the Penguin, but he was undoubtedly a tragic figure. He was famously sentenced to 2 years hard labour in 1895 at Reading Jail, and his crime was to love another man. Well, Victorian prisons were terrible places, particularly for a sensitive aesthete like Wilde. A butterfly broken on the wheel, it was said. And on the way to Reading Jail, he changed trains at Clapham Junction and found himself stranded for half an hour on the platform, surrounded by a jeering mob who'd recognised him. For years after that was done to me, he wrote, I wept every day at the same hour. And he wrote one of my favourite lines in all literature. We are the zanies of sorrow. We are the clowns whose hearts are broken. But he distilled from his suffering one of the greatest ballads ever written, the Ballad of Reading Jail. We rubbed the doors and scrubbed the floors and cleaned the shining rails, and rank by rank we soaped the plank and clattered with the pails. We sewed the sacks and broke the stones. We turned the dusty drill. We banged the tins and bawled the hymns. The poem describes the final days of Charles Thomas Woolsbridge, a soldier in the Scots Guards who murdered his wife in a fit of jealous rage, and he was hanged at Reading Jail while Wilde was there. 6 weeks our guardsman walked the yard, in a suit of shabby grey. His cricket cap was on his head, and his step seemed light and gay. But I never saw a man who looked so wistfully at the day. The hanging of the guardsman affected Wilde and the other prisoners profoundly. In the poem he describes an almost mystical transformation that overcame the prisoners in the days leading up to the execution. These men and women, and indeed children, were considered the dregs of society, many of them vicious cutthroats and murderers. But they became gripped by pity and compassion, which Wilde contrasts with the cruelty and brutality of the prison system that incarcerated them. In short, what Wilde saw was the grace of Christ moving among them. The warders with their shoes of felt crept by each padlocked door and peeked and saw with eyes of awe grey figures on the floor, and wondered why men knelt to pray who never prayed before. So this is our task, find ways to make bad men good. There are a number of reasons why this is a good idea. First, it gives the villain depth and makes him interesting. Secondly, the readers find themselves agreeably torn between conflicting emotions, an experience which they strangely enjoy. And thirdly, it evokes pity, maybe even tears, and stories are emotion delivery machines. And finally, by examining the moral dilemma of people doing bad things for good reasons or because they have little choice, we touch on huge themes of justice and goodness, evil and redemption, all of which effortlessly adds extra harmonics to your story. And it really isn't difficult to do. So what about Frankenstein? Remember I said I'd remove the bolts from his neck? Well, we find the human side to the creature made by Victor Frankenstein by returning to the source, Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein. In contrast to later movie adaptations, the original creature was far more morally complicated. There were no bolts in his neck. He was a man who started out by being kind and wanted one thing more than any other in the world: love. But he was so horribly disfigured that no one would allow him close. At one point he confronted Victor Frankenstein, his creator, and he told him how he wanted only to be loved and to love. I desire love and fellowship, and I was spurned. Was there no injustice in this? Am I to be thought the only criminal when all humankind sinned against me? He related how he once watched a family for many days enchanted by their domestic bliss, and so he collected firewood for them and left it on their doorstep. And they rejoiced until the day they saw his face, and they were so horrified by his appearance that they drove him away. And this was a story of his life. He begged Frankenstein to make him a mate so he would not be so lonely. Are you beginning to warm to him yet? He has a human side, right? I was benevolent and good, he said. Misery made me a fiend. Well, the movie versions leave most of this out, but not entirely. Everything hinges on the scene by the lake.
Who are you? I'm Maria. Will you play with me? Would you like one of my flowers? You have those, and I'll have these. I can make a boat. See how mine float?
In my view, the creature is not trying to murder the girl Maria. She was the only human who did not recoil from him. He was enchanted. Finally he had a friend. And look what happens before he throws her into the lake. He looks down at his empty hands. And he realizes he has no more flowers. So he throws Maria into the lake, thinking she will float like the flowers.
No, you're hurting me!
And he does this because he has the understanding of a child and the innocence. And it's obvious that he's overcome with remorse. In the Ballad of Reading Gaol, Oscar Wilde writes, "Each man kills the thing he loves." And so it is here too. Which brings us back to the soldier, Charles Thomas Woodbridge, who killed the wife he loved. Apparently, during the time he was in Reading Gaol, there was a petition appealing for clemency instigated and sent to the Home Secretary, Sir Matthew White Ridley. And in his final days, Charles Thomas Woodbridge heard of this, and he wrote a letter to the Home Secretary asking him to ignore the petition. He said he deserved to die for what he'd done. And if you would like more practical tips on sin, punishment, suffering, love and redemption, sign up for Gateway to Narnia, my free 10-part e-course on how to write your first novel. The link is in the description below.